A slight breeze had cleared the mist, and the sun poured its glad rays upon many a brave boy for the last time. Wheeling slightly to the left to squarely face the objective point, our line moved rapidly forward. The watchful foe, discovering us, poured in a deadly volley. Several fell at the first fire. The guns of Fort Sanders opened a point-blank fire on the work over our heads. With wild, mad shouts, our line dashed on into the vortex of their curved line where they poured on us a murderous fire from both flanks as well as in front. Bullets screamed and whistled through the air from all directions. There seemed to be lead enough in the air to almost shut out the light of the sun. As we came within range, the guns of Fort Sanders ceased firing, leaving the fight all to us. Coming upon the redoubt, our right swung forward so that they could fire directly into the end of the redoubt. At the first volley, the enemy broke and fled back to their reserve in the woods, close in their rear. Now having full possession of the earthwork, we took shelter on its outer face and fired over the top at the foe in the timber. I had seen Adjutant Noble and Lieutenant Gilpin fall before we reached the work. Lieutenant Gulliver had also been killed. Men had been falling all the way and were dropping every second now. While aiming over the work, a ball struck me in the right breast, passed through the lung and out at the back near the spine. Major Byington, who was in command, came and said to me, "You are badly hurt," passed on and had not gone 10 feet when he was hit almost simultaneously in the leg and in the side. Raising upon his knees, he called, "Pass the word to Captain Ruckle to take command and tell him for God's sake to get the boys out of this." Just at this moment, the 2 guns belched forth the signal to retreat. Those who were able got away. The enemy now advanced to reoccupy the work, and the infantry around Fort Sanders commenced firing to cover the retreat of our men. As the rebels approached us, they began calling to one another to bayonet the wounded. A swarthy rebel major with long black whiskers and a cocked Navy revolver in each hand dashed to the front and roared out, "Who says bayonet the wounded? Show me the son of a bitch." There was no more such talk. Reaching over the work, some rebels dragged me inside by the collar. I was semi-conscious by this time, but I remember that a rebel sergeant took my watch and gave it to one of my comrades with instructions to send it to my friends if he got out alive. I also remember the big rebel major ordered 4 men to place me on a stretcher and march in step, without flinching, back to the woods. This order he enforced at the muzzle of his 2 revolvers, although the air was full of shrieking leaden missiles of both friend and foe. This action did not last half an hour, yet in that time, 160 men had driven 200 men from an entrenchment, they being supported by a whole brigade not 80 rods away. 86 out of the 160 were killed and wounded. No advantage had been gained. It was impossible to hold the work without moving a large force outside our entrenchments. This was apparent to most everyone before the work was taken. In view of all the conditions, the person or persons ordering this move were pronounced guilty of official murder by all who witnessed it. The stretcher bearers deposited me on the grass near a little brook in the woods. I must have been dazed, for I do not recollect seeing any other wounded men or many others near me. A rebel straggler came and asked what he could do for me. I asked for water to quench the burning thirst that was upon me. I drank his small cups of water, about as fast as he could bring them from the brook. He stayed with me for some time. Finally, telling me he must go, he asked if I had a jackknife, pocketbook, or any greenbacks to sell. I gave him the old knife I had in my pocket for his kindness. This he refused to accept without pay, and thrust 2 Confederate dollars in my bloody pocket. After a time, I was loaded into an ambulance and driven by a wood road, the longest journey of my life. The distance was not more than 2 or 3 miles, yet it seemed everlasting. Every root or stone the wheel struck hurt me terribly. The driver was as careful as he could be, yet every jolt seemed as if it would take my life away. At last, we reached Middlebrook Paper Mill, situated upon a creek of the same name in the woods. In this mill, the rebels had improvised a hospital. Around the door stood a group of surly-looking rebel soldiers. The ambulance driver called for help to get me out of the ambulance. No one moved or said a word. He begged for help with like results. He cursed and swore, but got no help or words. At last, in desperation, he seized me by the heels, dragged me out far enough to get my middle on his hip under his arm. In this manner, he carried me as he might have carried a bag of wheat into the mill and let me drop upon the floor. For a time, I lost entire consciousness. After a time, an attendant dragged me around upon some paper clippings and informed me that was to be my bed. Soon after, I discovered Major Byington was lying with his feet to mine, and Sergeant Dix lying at my side with some other members of my regiment, and rebels filling the room. Without blankets or cover of any kind, we lay upon this handful of litter in the fireless old mill, with a cold raw autumn storm coming on. A dozen or more of the 2nd Michigan were there, and perhaps 50 wounded rebels. Amid the groans and howls of the Confederates, we, Yanks, bore out the almost endless night, enduring our pain and discomfort in silence. We received absolutely no attention, except occasionally a mouthful of water when we could intercept a nurse who had been awakened by the importunate howling of some Confederate sufferer. At such times, these rebel nurses would say, "Why don't you uns howl like our men?" Through the open doorways, we could see the cold, drizzling rain come down outside, while our feverish bodies were drying our blood-soaked garments until they gouged our wounds at the slightest move. What a longing for plenty of water to cool the parched lip. What a desire to be freed from the stiff and cruel clothes. What a pleasure a bath would give, and how grateful a mouthful of food would be. No one can guess who has not had the experience. During the day, the stalwart rebel discovered I had a good pair of boots and proposed to buy them off me with Confederate money, saying, "They will do you no good." Thinking he would take them anyway, I proposed to trade them to him for a blanket and an old pair of shoes. He accepted my offer and brought an old blanket with many holes and a worn-out pair of shoes many sizes too small for me. The blanket did me some good. Just at dark, a nurse brought us 2 soggy biscuits and a thin slice of fresh pork, the only food we had taken in 48 hours. As soon as it was fairly dark, the nurses all went to bed and left everyone to care for themselves. The suffering from cold and thirst and stiffening wounds was terrible. During the night, a fat rebel captain who had been brought in wounded vigorously denounced the Confederacy, winding up his bitter tirade with, "A cause that gives so poor care and little attention to its wounded is not worth fighting for." A citizen of Atlanta, Georgia, with one leg drawn up, was caring for his son near me. Upon my complaint that it hurt me when his short leg came down, he said, with tears in his eyes, "I will be as careful as I can, but my poor boy is dying. If there is anything I can do for you, don't be afraid to ask me." The poor boy did die, and as soon as his father left, the rascally rebel nurses woke up and went through his pockets. This night and all day, November 26th, we were left without care. Such a long night and such a distressful day are never to be forgotten. A black-haired, black-eyed, dark-complexioned Confederate soldier came to me and asked in kindly tones what was the nature of my wound. After examination, he informed me he did not belong to the hospital, but would try to make me more comfortable. Procuring a hand basin and bandages, he washed my wounds carefully and was about to dress them, when the basin and bandage were snatched away with, "We cannot attend to the amputation cases alone without caring for others." However, he seized the end of the roll of bandage and tore off enough to pass around my body, between my stiff clothes and the wounds. The litter of paper was taken out. The floor swept and fresh straw was put on the floor for us to lie upon. Dr. Burton, the rebel surgeon in charge, came and looked at me and started to pass on. I hailed him with, "You old rebel, what do you think about it? Hello, Yank, you're going to live." Who said I wasn't? Well, what's the matter with you, anyway? I should think, after a man had been under your care for a week or two, you would try to find out. His head dropped upon his breast, and he replied, "The lamentable fact is, we have almost nothing to do with." After a little more talk, he produced 2 morphine powders from his vest pocket and gave them to me to take when I could not rest without them. He ordered the nurses to give me all the whiskey I would take, and left me. And that was all the care of attention I received at the hands of the rebels. What a long night of fever and thirst. Federal and Confederates were moaning for water throughout the night, nurses taking their rest undisturbed by the distress of friend or foe. I rested easier during the day under the influence of morphine and whiskey. Toward evening, I saw large masses of troops moving toward the Confederate right. I informed Major Byington, and he questioned the surgeon about it. They said they were preparing to assault the Union fort, Fort Sanders. What hopes and fears for our comrades in Knoxville kept our pain and suffering company through another long night. About 3 o'clock in the morning, there suddenly burst upon our ears the sound of rapid artillery firing and musketry in the direction of Knoxville. The simple inquiry, "Are you awake?" were all the words that passed between us wounded Union prisoners, but pain and discomfort were forgotten in the anxiety for the outcome. The heavy detonations following one another in quick succession and the ceaseless heavy roll of musketry assured us that the action was fierce and bloody. How we longed to be with our own brave comrades, and how we waited for day to reveal to us the results. Long before it was light, the firing slackened and finally ceased altogether. Silently, we waited for the surgeon to appear, and when he came, the lack of jubilation in his manner told us plainly enough that Fort Sanders had not been taken. Major Byington asked, "What success, Doctor?" "Oh, we planted 7 stands of colors on the fort, but we failed to take it." "How many did you lose?" "Oh, not many." The major, with great effort, raised himself on one elbow and said, "You never planted 7 stands of colors on Fort Sanders without losing 1,000 men. We afterward learned they lost over 1,200, over 400 dead, and our loss was 3 killed and 3 wounded." After noon, 2 officers from General Longstreet's staff came with paroles for us to sign. Toward evening, the Union wounded were placed in ambulances and sent to our own lines. Major Byington and myself were placed in the same wagon, the driver was changed at the picket line, and we were taken to the courthouse in Knoxville. What joy was ours to be once more under the protection of the glorious old stars and stripes with our own faithful comrades to care for us. My first inquiry was, "Have you got anything to eat?" The nurse laughed at my eagerness and said, "Just as soon as I can get these stinking clothes off you." When my clothes were taken off, they were so rigid with dried blood that they stood up straight and firm as sheet iron. In a few minutes they brought me 2 large crackers and a half pint of beef tea. My next tribulation was to know if that was all I could have. The nurse laughed and answered, "That's all tonight. You'll pull through without doubt." What a release from trouble, and what a sweet sleep I had that night.